All right. Hello. My name is Asmo Urpilainen and welcome to another webinar from Frends Technology. This time we're really excited to showcase some of our latest features around AI-augmented development. And all of those features will be coming to a Frends near you in the next 6.0 version that we've actually just last week released. And basically today in the webinar, I want to walk you through a little bit behind the thinking we have here on the product team on how did we end up building these AI augmented features the way we did. How do we view, let's say, AI augmented development and actually AI in general a bit in the context of Frends. And then, of course, focus heavily on showcasing the features in action to give you a really good idea on how you could actually use these features to assist you in your daily operations and work with the platform, but also perhaps to give you new ideas on how you can actually get these features to the rest of your team to boost productivity and of course the usage of the platform in general. But I think without any further ado, let's just jump straight into the agenda. So some of the thoughts here behind Frends 6.0 or what was the thinking that got to us in this point might warrant a story around AI in general. So actually we've been thinking about implementing AI features into Frends for quite some time now already. I would say that the first time we talked about this internally was somewhere in 2018, 2019. And back then, of course, we used to talk about traditional or classical machine learning, as it's called nowadays. And our idea basically at that point was that because Frends is built on standardized technologies, we're using Microsoft .NET, we're writing C# code, we are working with BPM and 2.0, the globally accepted notation, to define our integrations. This standardization actually would allow us to create more traditional machine learning models to basically help the developer create the needed configuration that the development is basically all about while creating integrations using the platform. But unfortunately, back in 2018 and 19, we were at a situation that the technology simply wasn't quite yet there. So we put basically our AI thoughts and thinking around AI augmented development on the shelf for a while. But of course, then unrolled 2022 or 2021, depends a little bit on how you look at it. And of course, the advent of large language models and especially ChatGPT, which of course I think everyone should be very familiar already by now. And this actually led us to trying out our use cases we had thought out previously with the new ChatGPT models. But the ChatGPT, let's say GPT models 3.5 or 3, weren't actually quite yet capable enough to deliver the results that we wanted. So again, we had to wait a bit. But luckily, or I would say not luckily, but inevitably, last year, I think the models caught up to our vision and I think our goal when it comes to AI-assisted development. And actually, the newer versions of pretty much all the large language models out there were now suddenly capable of delivering basically exactly the experience we wanted to for the user, both from a usability as well as from basically a security and governance perspective. And I think that leads us a little bit to our approach to AI in general. So of course now with Frends 6.0, we are now introducing the first set of AI augmented features. More is going to follow or more to be followed later this year and of course going into the future. So the first tenet I think we want to kind of cover here in regards to our approach or overall approach to AI is that we always want to use AI where it makes sense and not kind of shove AI down the throats of our users as we see some other platforms and I guess software doing nowadays, that everyone is just talking about AI and AI has to be present absolutely everywhere. But we really want to consider, first of all, what's the use case we want to utilize AI and more specifically large language models for, and also how do we integrate that into the actual experience within the platform so that then it's a net positive experience and not just another way of doing basically the same thing that you were doing previously. As you might know, we here at Frends are, of course, very, very conscious about security and especially transparency. So this also, of course, covers our approach to AI, meaning that soon in the demos that we're going to, or when we're going to be taking a little bit of a look on the actual new features we're bringing in the Frends 6.0 release, all of the AI features we're introducing now, as well as in the future, follow basically a design pattern where, first of all, we want to always let the user have access to all of the data that the AI is actually processing. So we want to be able to show to the user that, hey, if you do this, this is the data the AI model is going to be using, and also, of course, let the user be in full control of that, so the user can actually manage and, for example, even delete certain portions of the data the AI model is going to be working with if the user feels uncomfortable having that data be accessible for the AI. The second tenet is, of course, that anything and everything you do with an AI should leave a very, very clear audit log entry. And we, of course, follow that with absolutely all interactions with AI, so that from a governance and security perspective, you can actually see what the developers, what the users have done in regards to AI later down the line, and of course to get better visibility and understanding on if something has been perhaps done with the AI as that shouldn't have been there. And of course, lastly, I think it's all about context for us. So when we say that we really want the experience of the AI to be seamless in the usage of the platform, what we mean from a practical perspective is that we want the AI model to understand where the user is in that particular moment in the user's journey and provide contextual information about that stage in the user's experience or journey, so that the model can actually provide much more meaningful answers for that very particular scenario or very particular time the user is requesting to use the AI, rather than it be more generic and, let's say, available across the board. And most of these tenets I think we just covered should become quite apparent, since we're going to be covering those from a practical feature perspective in the upcoming demos. But I think enough with the slides, and we can just jump straight into the introduction of the first AI features. So basically, the first ones we have here are code generator assistant. So we're going to be having a couple of assistant AIs and a couple of generator AIs. And just before we jump into actually the platform or the Frends side of things, all of you are probably familiar with how in Frends we basically create integrations using these processes. And basically, in a nutshell, what the code generator AI is capable of doing is writing any kind of either simple, complex, arbitrary, non-arbitrary code to perform a certain type of integration functionality as part of the integration process execution, so it will actually be accessed through the code shape itself. So if we now actually bump over to the platform side here, and we open up a code or basically a process editor here, you can see I have a sample process here with a simple manual trigger where the user would be able to provide a website that we want to now target within our demo. And let's say if our demo use case here today was to, let's say, grab the domain from the arbitrary URL or website the user provides, use that domain to retrieve, let's say, all of the contacts belonging to that domain from our CRM system, and perhaps, let's say, modify those users by adding in a new attribute. So, of course, the way I would have previously done this is I would have perhaps modeled out the process, thought about what I need to do in certain steps and how I actually need to configure the integration process to make this happen. Now with, of course, our new AIs implemented, and more specifically the code generation AI, I can still, of course, plug in that code step or code shape into my process. But now, of course, instead of having to write the actual C# code from scratch, you can see that when you open up the code shape, there is a fancy new button here called Frends Assistant, which is nicely also highlighted for you so you won't be able to miss it. And the idea is that whenever you're doing development and you have the assistant button present, when you click it, that's when the AI assistant actually opens up in a new modal on top of your existing view. And this is really the key to the context. So before we actually dive into the let's say, usage of the assistant itself, I want to show you a pretty cool feature here about the context, like I mentioned, which is really what drives our AI to be basically on the next level. So not only have we, of course, trained the AI model and, of course, given it a bunch of directions and examples and samples to understand how Frends works as a product and how developers are using the platform when actually creating these integrations, we're all the time we're all the time, of course, also providing them with this, let's say, very detailed context. And the context is really what allows the AI to understand what data does the integration flow have access to, and what, let's say, data variables configuration exists in that particular Frends tenant. And that's, of course, always different from one Frends tenant to another, one integration process to another, and even from one development step inside an integration process to another. And like we mentioned, we of course allow the user to see in very, very clear terms the data being sent outside of Frends. We can of course allow the user to modify this. So if for whatever reason the user feels that the Salesforce, let's say, variable names here are not something we want the AI to have access to, the user can quite simply just delete those. And a good thing to note, or maybe highlight here, is that we're not, of course, not providing the AI with the actual addresses, passwords, and usernames. We are simply providing the AI with the information that when you are now going to be generating code, you will have access to for these particular variables using the Frends low-code notation. And overall, the entire purpose of this is basically to, like I mentioned earlier, to be as transparent as possible about what data the AI is actually going to be processing, how we are processing it, and of course, all of this is to build trust between the user and the AI model, of course, being used here. So if, like I mentioned, our use case now was to, let's say, pick out the domain from the website, what I could do is click on the Frends Assistant and simply ask the assistant to do that for me. So I could say that hey, or I could say that hey, can you let's say pick out the domain from the user provided website. And when we send that to the AI, well, you can also, of course, also immediately see that we get a streaming response back. But basically now, using the contextual data the user has access to, the AI model is able to, first of all, understand that in this particular step in the integration flow, we are going to be creating C# code because we have the code task selected. It understands that it needs to return what the user is requesting because we had set the option to be that we want something to be returned out of the code shape. And it, of course, understands that when I'm referencing the user-provided website, it's able to know that that actually means the data coming from the trigger where we had defined that website variable earlier. And of course, in between, it's simply using the best possible C#, let's say, function or method here for picking out the domain, which is converting the website to a URI object and then just picking out the host name that's then being returned out. And of course, as a user, I could now continue the conversation, so it will know and remember also the session I'm having with the AI. So if I wanted to tweak, let's say, the code in whatever form or fashion, I could ask it to do that. And of course, we also always provide you in the code, or provide you with nice comments directly in the code to help you understand what the AI is actually doing there and trying to achieve. But in this case, what I'll just quite simply do is say that, yes, I like this, so I'll thumbs it up. I'll click use, and that directly now copies over the generated code. And as you can see, because the AI is able to understand the context and the low-code approach of Frends completely, the code is basically plug and playable, so it will work straight away without any additional, let's say, testing or configuration needed. And I can be actually quite confident now that the domain will now be returned, and I'll just say that I want to store that into the domain variable. So let's say that now the next step in our, let's say, integration scenario here was, like I mentioned, find all the users in our CRM that belong to this particular domain. That actually allows us to go for the next AI in Frends 6, introduced in Frends 6.0, which is the task configurator assistant. So if the first one was to help the user create code based on the prompts that the user is providing, the second one is exactly the same, but instead of writing code, we are creating Frends task configuration. And again, exactly the same way as previously, where we access the assistant through the code shape, we access the task assistant through the task menu, where we first of all select what is the, let's say, task type we want to access in this case. So we could select the REST request task for our example here. And again, you can now see the Frends Assistant button lighting up, which now, in this case, when we click it, will of course have a completely different contextual data available. So of course now you can see that the previous variable we just created with our first AI generated step is now available as context for my second step. And of course, now what we also provide for the AI is what the task is actually doing for and what are the parameters that are available within that task, so that the AI is actually able to create and generate that ready-made configuration for me. So what that means from a practical perspective is that if I wanted to now find all of those, let's say, users from our CRM, which for example's sake we could assume to be, for example, HubSpot in this case, I could now ask the assistant to find all, let's say, contacts within HubSpot that have the domain in their email address. And I could also, let's say, further specify a bit more information for the model. I could say that use the version 3 API with the post method. And of course, if I now send this, let's say, prompt to the AI, again, you can see that it's thinking, it's using all of the context we have available to basically try and create the configuration for that particular task we just asked it to do. And now we can actually see that, hey, great, we have a response from the AI, and pretty much what the response is now showing us is that we have a pretty plain explanation on what the configurator AI now did. How did it end up in the configuration it provided? And actually, after that, a really cool way for us to provide, let's say, the response from the AI to the user is that we're actually showing you exactly the same task configuration view as you were seeing there with in, let's say, the normal Frends without the usage of the AI present. So it's actually basically fully automating the work of the developer by being able to provide you with the technical configuration to achieve what you're asking it to do within the context of that task. And a couple of things to highlight here again, because like I mentioned earlier, context is king, meaning that if we look at the configuration the task AI has now provided for us, we can actually see that it's first of all, able to understand that when I mention HubSpot, it wants to use the HubSpot URL I had stored within my Frends environment variables. And of course, it's then able to append the appropriate URL path using the version 3 API and the post method like I suggested it does. It's able to know and of course use for example, the search endpoint here for the contacts like I asked it to. And it's actually also able to know, for example, from the documentation that's available online for example, for HubSpot, but for any system pretty much, that the message you need to send to this particular API endpoint has to contain these filter groups with filters where we are targeting the email property, like I of course mentioned, and then it's able to know that I wanted it to filter those out so that then we have a reference to the domain that we set in, of course, the first step here. And to top things off, it's of course able to also set the correct API key authorization, again, because it understands that HubSpot needs to have this authentication, and in my environment variables, I had stored the API key and the URL previously. So again, it's actually able to use all the features of Frends and understand how those work together and how it's able to use the contextual information combined with all the knowledge the AI model already has, with, of course, the training data we're providing it. And this basically approach with the contextual data means that the AI use case or model here will work out of the box with every Frends task that we have. So that actually means that that will support all of our current tasks. It will support all of your custom tasks. It will support all of the tasks that we might or you might create in the future, because it's not reliant on the task itself being part of the training data, and it's only reliant on the contextual information of what the task is actually aiming to do within this context and what sort of parameters are present within that task. And of course, this was just a simple sample of how you can utilize these new AI features. And of course, we hope that all of you, our beloved users, will start trying these assistants out with the Frends 6.0 release. And like you probably noticed there, we do have the user sentiment thumbs up or thumbs down for every response. And of course, we do have to mention that even though we are quite proud on the capabilities that the AI is actually able to do and able to show or basically perform for the user, it is still an AI model. So you need to use caution and you need to verify what the result is. And of course, the more you provide that user sentiment, that thumbs up, thumbs down, that's of course something that then we can use later to make the models even better. And all of that is of course then stored here in the AI audit log, like I mentioned previously, where you can see all of the previous AI queries or prompts that have been made within your Frends, with the option of course also perhaps deleting or clearing some of the data if that's something that you would like to do or need to do if you, for example, make a prompt by mistake that you were not supposed to within that context. Lastly but not leastly, if we look at the AI features here, we of course still have the documentation generation assistant. So this is of course using now all of the features we covered here previously and putting those together. So if our first step here was to, let's say, find or parse the domain from the website, like so, and our second step was now find all contacts with that domain, we could say that our final step would then be, for example, writing those contacts, write contacts to a file, and we would be happy with that process. So now what we can do with a ready-made process such as this or any existing integration is that we are first of all introducing a new button or feature here called documentation. So documentation is basically an artifact that's attached to any Frends integration process or sub-process. And what the documentation is it's exactly as it sounds like. So if you open the documentation up, that will show you a new view where it, of course, now for my new integration says that this process doesn't have any documentation yet, but this will let me create documentation using the markdown format. So this is quite a clever and a nice way for you to store any technical or business-related documentations directly within Frends about the integration flow you're working with. And of course, we can now use all of that contextual information we just looked at previously to generate the documentation using the AI, where it's able to basically determine or figure out why the integration is created in the first place, what could be possible exception scenarios that perhaps the developer should take into account, how the logic of the execution works, what are the most important, let's say, pieces of information within the execution, like, for example, being able to summarize that when we are grabbing the domain, we're using a C# crypt and we're storing it in the variable #var domain. When we are making that call to a HubSpot CRM API, we're doing a REST request and, of course, using the search interface, etc., etc. And, of course, maybe define any error handling practices. So for the documentation generation, we have used our extensive knowledge about integration projects and of course, the hundreds and hundreds of documentations that we've done over the years and basically boiled that down into the most essentials needed by any integrator, even outside of Frends, to understand what this integration is actually doing. And again, of course, I could click use, which then takes and copies that generated documentation for my new documentation feature here. And after clicking OK, of course, I now have a nicely rendered view of the documentation with the option of course, being able to edit what the AI is able to generate for me in the context of the documentation. So that's all that we had when it comes to basically AI features. So to sum things up here a bit, we can write any kind of arbitrary code using the AI. It's able to understand the context of the developer, the context of the actual environment, and the context of the integration use case the developer is working with. Really good use cases for the, let's say, code generator AI could be modifying data in existing data structures, adding in new, let's say, data properties, ordering data, determining if, let's say, something about a data set is true or false, picking out complicated pieces of data, like, for example, in our example, the domain from a website, doing calculations, anything where you basically need to have some sort of a data input, modify or work with that somehow and get an output. That's really the ideal use case for the code generator AI. We have the task configurator AI, which of course lets you now streamline and automate the process of picking out a Frends task and having that be something that you configure for your use case, so the AI is able to fully automate that from an end-to-end perspective. And of course, being able to work with all the entire task coverage of Frends is key here. And of course, the main benefit of this is to streamline, like I said, streamline the configuration part, so make it even faster and easier. And oftentimes you can skip, for example, looking at the documentation of a given system, because the AI already has access to all of the information on the internet, and thus typically the documentation of the system you're integrating to as well. And finally, of course, the documentation feature supported by the documentation AI that we're able to use to create a pretty, let's say, not flawless, but close to flawless technical and functional documentation on what the integration is doing, how is it doing it. And the, of course, goal here is that by reading through the documentation, you would be able to, or anyone would be able to understand on a very detailed level how the integration works and what is its purpose. Before we wrap up for today, we have one last thing to cover, which is a smaller feature but still part of Frends 6.0. That's called the Frends DMN task. So that's actually a completely new shape in the process editor kit that we are providing for you to define your integrations. And this is actually a highly requested feature from you, our customers, and was one of the most voted features last year. Where if you're not familiar with DMN, I would suggest you maybe perhaps Google DMN and have a little bit of a look. But it's a similar globally accepted open source standard as BPMN 2.0, so the process notation we're using. And DMN actually stands for Decision Model and Notation, where the ideology is that it's basically a table of different sorts of scenarios regarding input data that should result in some sort of an output. And from a practical perspective, what this means is that, for example, in this integration where we are processing new employees and, of course, ordering different types of credentials and subscriptions for them, we can now actually create a table where we say that one of the input values is now the number of subordinates, supporting, of course, the normal Frends low-code notation here. The other input type is the employee type. And now we are simply saying that if subordinates is 0 and the employee type is employee, the output should be employee. If the employee type is employee, but there's more than 1 or 0 subordinates, then actually that means that there has been some sort of a mistake, and the employee should actually be a manager, because you are a manager if you have subordinates. And of course, you can now think and expand on this ideology where you're able to define any number of input parameters and create basically combinations or rule sets, as many as you need. So we are supporting even several hundred different rule sets where you can then basically map a set of data into a certain type of outcome. And of course, you can now use that outcome, for example, in the follow-up processing. So previously, we of course had to do this in perhaps a code shape, which might have been a little bit annoying or difficult to maintain. So the DNM shapes makes basically creating and maintaining these mapping tables much easier. And also, for example, allows us to have multiple dimension support here with full DMN support. And we don't have time to go into all the details of what exactly does DMN support from, let's say, the logic point of view, but you can see that we can do all kinds of different rule sets, pretty much covering most business rule decision-making scenarios using the DMN task as help there. And before we wrap up completely or finally for this time, maybe spend just a few moments here talking about perhaps the future of Frends and going beyond Frends 6.0. So we will, of course, probably be having a webinar in the future about the Frends roadmap for 2025, and that is still, of course, publicly available even now on our website, frends.com/roadmap. But we have big plans around, of course, improving our augmented AI development capabilities, but also helping customers take AI into use to their organization. And we actually did our first webinar on this topic in December. So I would highly advertise that you go and have a look on that webinar as well. And basically going forward, I think the introduction and our approach to these AI augmented features will dramatically change the way you work with the platform. And I hope we have really succeeded in our goal of not just bringing in AI, but actually provide meaningful benefits for the users using AI. And this is, of course, the path that we plan on continuing on improving. Thank you so much for today, and hope to see you in the next episode.